Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The Sierra Avalada Mountains weren't much to look at in February, just white slopes interrupted by patches of black pine, their needles rattling like bones when the wind cut through. But for Jedediah Cutter, the mountains were all he had left. They'd been his refuge when the world had taken everything else. The snow was deep that morning, drifting waist-high in places. Jed pushed through it on snowshoes, his heavy coat weighed down by frost. Over his shoulder, a brace of snowshoe. Hair hung stiff and frozen, their fur already crusting with ice. Clarence, his mule, plodded behind him with the silent patience of a creature that had long ago stopped hoping for an easier life. Yet's cabin came into view, a squat, weathered thing built from logs he'd cut himself a decade ago. Smoke leaked reluctantly from the chimney. Inside, it smelled of cedar pitch and cold iron. He dropped the hairs on the table, unhooked his rifle from his shoulder, and rubbed the ache out of his hands. 3 years had passed since Claire had left him. She'd been a good woman in her way, but she'd had her heart set on children. Back then, Jed had believed it would happen. He dreamed of a little one toddling around the cabin, learning to throw stones, shoot a bow, maybe even carry a rifle. Then came the long months with no news, no signs, and the eventual trip to Silverton, where a doctor with soft hands told him, in polite but final words, that he was unlikely to father children naturally. Jed didn't remember the ride home. He just remembered Claire's silence, the way she stared at the horizon for a week, and the letter she left on the table one morning. By the time he found it, she was halfway to Kansas with a banker named Miller, who had a smile like polished brass dots. Since then, Jed had kept mostly to himself. He hunted, trapped, and sometimes rode into town for supplies, speaking to no one unless necessary. The mountains didn't ask questions about the family he never had. That was why, when he came into Pine Knot that February afternoon, he wasn't looking for company, especially not the kind he found. The main street of Pine Knot was half mud, half snow, with wind tossing grit into folks' eyes. He hitched Clarence outside McGreevy's General Store and stepped off the boardwalk to shake the stiffness out of his knees. That's when he saw them. 3 children, standing together like driftwood washed up after a storm. The oldest, a boy, maybe 12 or 13, had the hollow-cheeked look of someone who'd been skipping meals. His coat was patched with mismatched cloth, and his boots were 2 sizes too large. The girl, smaller by a couple years, had a long braid tucked into the collar of a threadbare dress. She clutched a ragged doll to her chest, as if it could keep her warm. The smallest, a boy no older than 8, was barefoot in the snow, standing straight despite the cold, with dark hair falling into eyes sharp as flint. Beside them stood Harvey Black. Jed knew Harvey the way a wolf knows a coyote, not friendly, not trusting, but aware. Harvey dealt in whatever made him money: pelts, whiskey, mining tools, sometimes things a man shouldn't deal in at all. He had a bowler hat tipped low against the wind, and his gloved hands rested on his hips like he owned the ground under. His feet, orphans. Harvey barked, his voice carrying over the wind. 3 good young'uns here, no one to claim him. Church can't keep 'em, the railroad's no charity. $3 for the lot, $3, and you can put 'em to work before spring thaw. Some folks walked past without looking. A couple of miners stopped, eyed the children, then shook their heads and moved on. Jed felt something cold settle in his gut. He turned toward the store, meaning to mind his business. But the smallest boy was staring at him. Not just glancing staring, like he'd been waiting for Jed to appear. Then, through the whistling wind, the boy spoke one word. "Pa?" Jed stopped in his tracks. He turned slowly, meeting the boy's gaze. "You got the wrong man, kid," he said, his voice low. The boy didn't blink. "No, I don't." For a moment, Jed thought about walking on. But the look in the boy's eyes, steady, searching, almost certain, held him there like a rope around his chest. Harvey grinned, seeing the hesitation. "Cutter, you want them or not? $3. That's a steal. They'll be gone in an hour." Yet's hand went to his coat pocket. He felt the weight of $3 silver, his last until the spring pelts came in. He could walk away, let somebody else take the burden, but he was already reaching for the coins. They hit Harvey's palm with a metallic clink. Harvey tipped his hat, grinning like a man who just sold a broken horse for full price. "Pleasure doing business, Jed. They're yours now." Jed glanced down at the children. None of them smiled. The oldest just nodded slightly. The girl kept her eyes on the doll. And the smallest boy, Sam, though Jed didn't know his name, yet stood as if the exchange had been expected all along. That was the day Jed Cutter's quiet, lonely life began to change, though he wouldn't understand just how much until much later. The wind had picked up by the time Jed left Pine Knot with the 3 children in tow. Snowflakes swirled in the air, stinging the skin, and the temperature was dropping fast enough to make a man think twice about breathing too deep. Clarence, the mule, trudged ahead, carrying a sack of flour and a jug of kerosene. Jed hadn't said a word since handing Harvey the coins. He wasn't sure what to say. A man could talk himself into a lot of things in the space of a mile. How it was just charity, how it was temporary, how he was only keeping the children from freezing in the streets, but none of it sounded right. In his own head, the children kept pace behind him. The oldest boy was sturdy enough to keep up without complaint, though Jed could see him glancing often at his younger companions, checking their footing in the snow. The girl walked silently, clutching her doll under her chin. The smallest boy barefoot, and yet somehow unfazed, marched forward, as if he'd been on this trail before. About halfway to the cabin, the oldest boy spoke. "You really our new pa, mister?" Jed didn't look back. "No, I'm just a man with a warm cabin and too much room in it." The boy didn't reply, but the girl glanced at her brother and then up at Jed. Her voice was small, like she was speaking to the wind instead of a person. "We can work. We won't be trouble." Yet's boots crunched in the snow. "That's not the question." "What's the question?" the boy asked. Jed didn't answer. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. Jed pushed open the heavy door, and a rush of pine-scented warmth greeted them from the banked fire inside. He gestured them in and hung his coat on the wall. The children stepped in, their eyes roaming over the single large runestone fireplace on one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a bed in the far corner, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans, flour, and salt pork. Jed went about lighting a lamp, and stoked the fire until the logs caught and began to crackle. He handed each child a tin mug of hot water from the kettle, which they drank as if it were the finest coffee in the territories. When their cheeks began to show some color again, Jed asked, "What are your names?" The oldest spoke first, "Eli." He nodded toward the girl. "That's Annie." Jed looked at the youngest. The boy's eyes, dark, unblinking, held his. "Sam," he said. "Sam Cutter." Jed set the mug down a little too hard. "What did you say? Sam Cutter?" The boy didn't flinch. "That's my name." "Your name's not Cutter," Jed said flatly. "That's my name." Sam shrugged. "Ma said it's mine too." Jed stared at the boy, his mind turning over things he hadn't thought about in years. "And where's your ma now?" Sam's voice didn't waver. "Dead. Last winter. Fever took her." The cabin went quiet except for the pop of the fire. Jed glanced at Eli and Annie, but neither seemed surprised by the claim. After a long moment, Jed stood. "There's jerky and bread in the cupboard. Eat what you need. There's blankets in the trunk by the bed. You'll sleep by the fire tonight." Without another word, he stepped outside into the dusk, closing the door behind him. The cold air burned in his lungs as he walked to the edge of the clearing past the stacked woodpile. He leaned on the axe handle, staring at the darkening line of the mountains. Cutter. The name came back to him like a ghost, tied to a memory he'd shoved deep down a summer in Denver, years before the cabin, before Claire. A woman with hair like polished chestnut, laughter that carried through the noise of the saloon. Her name was Martha Gaines. They'd spent a week together, then she was gone without a word. And now this boy with her eyes was standing in Yet's cabin, calling him Pad. He could demand proof. He could throw the children back to the church in town and be done with it. But when he thought of the wind whipping through Pine Knot and Harvey Black's smirk, the thought soured in his mouth. By the time Jed went back inside, the three were already curled up in blankets by the fire, the bread half eaten, the jerky untouched. Sam was awake, staring into the flames, as if he knew exactly what Jed was thinking. The next morning dawned pale and brittle. Jed handed Eli an axe and led him to the woodpile. "Show me what you know," he said. The boy's first swing was all strength and no aim. Jed corrected his grip and showed him how to split along the grain. Annie followed them out with a basket, and Jed sent her to the snare line behind the cabin, showing her where to check the loops for rabbits. Sam stayed close to the cabin, asking questions in a steady stream. How old was Clarence? How far was town? Could a man get to Mexico from here if he kept walking? It was mid-afternoon when Jed caught himself answering more questions than he ignored. The boy's persistence was wearing away at him like water on stone. That night, they ate hot stew by the fire. Jed was starting to think maybe, just maybe, he could get used to the sound of more than one spoon scraping a tin bowl. But trouble wasn't far. It never was in the high country. It came 3 days later in the form of hoofbeats on frozen ground. Jed stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, and saw Harvey Black riding up the trail with 2 hard-looking men carrying rifles. Harvey reined in a dozen yards from the cabin. His grin was gone. "Cutter," he called. "I've got a man in Santa Fe who'll pay me double what you gave for those brats. I'll take 'em now." Jed didn't move. "They're not for sale." The men with Harvey shifted in their saddles, rifles angled low. The air between them was as cold and sharp as the snow underfoot, and for the first time in years, Jed Cutter felt something worth fighting for. "I said," Harvey repeated, his breath steaming, "I'll take 'em now." Jed Cutter stepped down from the porch and planted his boots in the snow. The boards behind him creaked as Eli, Annie, and Sam peered out the doorway. Yet's shotgun rested casually in his hands, but the way his fingers curled over the stock made it clear he wasn't aiming for show. "They're not going anywhere," Jed said. Harvey's mouth twisted into something halfway between a smile and a sneer. $3 for the lot. What do you think that buys you? You think that makes you their kin? Cutter, you're a trapper. You've got no use for mouths that don't work a trap line." "I'll find a use," Jed replied. The man on Harvey's right shifted in his saddle. He was a wiry fellow with a scar across his jaw. "Harvey," he said, "it's cold. Let's just take the kids and be done with it." Yet's shotgun came up an inch. "You put a boot on that snow, and you'll be done, all right?" The 2 riflemen locked eyes with him, measuring. Harvey, to Yet's surprise, raised a hand to keep them back. "Fine," Harvey said, drawing the word out like taffy. "You keep your little snowbirds for now. But you mark me, Cuttermen in Santa pay well for fresh young stock. Sooner or later, you'll want the money more than you want the trouble." He turned his horse and started back down the trail, his men following. Jed didn't lower the shotgun until they were specks on the ridge. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in days, though the fire hadn't been touched since morning. Annie stood by the hearth, her eyes wide. Eli held himself stiff, like he was trying to stand guard. Sam just looked at Jed. "You knew them men?" Sam asked. "Know enough," Jed said, setting the shotgun on the table. "Were they gonna take?" "You?" Annie's voice trembled. "They were gonna try," Jed said. Eli stepped forward. "Why didn't you just let him? We'd been sold before." That stopped Jed cold. "What do you mean sold?" Eli's jaw tightened. "After Ma died, Harvey got us from some folks outside Durango. Said he'd find us work. He didn't. Just hauled us from place to place, seeing who'd pay. Nobody wanted all three, so he kept us together till he found someone who would." Jed felt something knot up inside him. "And before Durango?" Eli shrugged. "We were with Ma. That's all." Jed looked at Sam. The boy hadn't taken his eyes off him. "You still say I'm your pa?" Sam nodded once. "Ma said so. She told me before she got sick. Said if I ever found you, you'd keep me safe." Jed turned away, running a hand over his beard. He'd known Martha Gaines for 1 week 7 days in Denver 12 years ago. They'd met in the back room of a saloon, playing poker against miners too drunk to count their own coins. She'd had a laugh like river water over rocks, bright and quick. They'd shared whiskey, bad cards, and a bed until she was gone one morning without goodbye. Could she have been carrying his child when she left? He wanted to say it wasn't possible. He wanted to believe the doctor's words, that he was unlikely to father children. But unlikely wasn't the same as impossible. Over the next few days, Jed settled the children into a rhythm. Eli took naturally to woodcutting, learning how to read the grain and split a log clean. Annie proved she had an eye for setting snares, checking them each morning with a focus. Jed respected Dot. Sam stayed close, always watching. He didn't ask for stories like other children. He asked questions. How far could a man see from the top of the highest peak? Could wolves be tamed? What happened if you shot a gun into the air and it came down on someone's head? At first, Jed tried to ignore the questions, but soon he found himself answering, explaining the things a man learns from living on the edge of wilderness. He caught himself talking more in a week than he had in months. Still, the question of Sam's parentage gnawed at him. Late at night, when the fire was low, Jed would look across the room at the boy's sleeping face, the shadow of lashes on his cheeks, and see Martha's eyes staring back from memory. On the 7th morning since Harvey's visit, Jed was down by the creek chopping ice for water when hoofbeats came again on the trail. This time it wasn't Harvey. It was old Harlan Price, a trapper from across the ridge. "Jed," Harlan called, reining up. "You been in town lately?" "Last week," Jed said. "You hear about the bounty?" Jed straightened. "What bounty?" Harlan glanced toward the cabin door before lowering his voice. "There's talk in Pine Not a Man's put a price on 3 runaway orphans. Description fits the ones you've got. Word is, the man's headed this way." Yet's grip tightened on the axe handle. "Who's the man?" Harlan shook his head. "Didn't say. But folks are whispering he's got law papers in his pocket. Might make it legal." Jed looked back at the cabin, where the door stood half open, and 3 small faces were watching him. Whatever Sam's truth was, it no longer mattered. Jed knew one thing. If someone came to take those children, they'd have to go through him, and Jed Cutter had spent a lifetime making sure no man walked over him twice. Jed Cutter knew it before he saw the man. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that settles right before trouble steps out of the shadows. The children were inside, Eli mending a split axe handle, Annie kneading dough at the table, and Sam sitting cross-legged by the fire, whittling a stick to a sharp point. Jed was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, coming up the trail from the south. He wiped his hands on his coat, picked up his shotgun, and stepped into the clearing. The rider came into view, tall, narrow-shouldered, wearing a long black coat that hung heavy with damp snow. His horse was a rangy bay, ribs just showing under its winter coat, but it moved with the patience of an animal used to long miles. The rider stopped 10 yards away. His face was clean-shaven, his eyes pale as creek ice, and there was a tin star pinned low on his coat, where most men might not notice it until it was too late. "You, Jed Cutter?" the man asked, his voice flat. "I am," Jed said. The man reached into his coat, slow enough to show he wasn't drawing iron, and pulled out a folded paper. He held it up. "Warrant says you're in possession of 3 minors belonging to the custody of one Harvey Black, trader out of Durango." Jed didn't take the paper. "They don't belong to Harvey. He's no kin. Warrant says otherwise. My job's to bring him back. You can make it easy, or you can make it hard." Jed shifted his weight, keeping the shotgun easy in his hands. "You got children?" The bounty hunter's expression didn't change. "Ain't relevant." "It's relevant to me," Jed said. "Because if you did, you'd understand I ain't sending these 3 back to the kind of man who'd sell 'em by the pound." The hunter's pale eyes narrowed. "You willing to die over it?" Jed didn't answer right away. The snowflakes drifted between them, melting against the warmth of the cabin's chimney smoke. Finally, he said, "If it comes to it." The cabin door creaked. Jed didn't have to turn to know Sam had stepped outside. The boy stood barefoot in the snow, watching the exchange with that same steady gaze that had stopped Jed in Pine Knot. "Pa?" Sam's voice carried, clear as a bell in the still air. The bounty hunter's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to Jed. "That your son?" Jed hesitated. In his mind, the answer came in 2 parts, the one the blood might say, and the one the other say, and the one the answer heart already knew. "Yes," Jed said, "that's my son." The hunter studied him for a long moment, then sighed through his nose. "Warrant don't say nothing about blood. It says wards of Harvey Black. I take 'em back, I get paid. I walk away, I don't." Yet's grip on the shotgun didn't ease, then walk away. The hunter looked at Sam again. "Whatever." He saw there made him shift in the saddle, restless. He folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. "Harvey's not the first to pay me," the hunter said. "But maybe he's the first I won't deliver to. You didn't get this mercy from me." He turned the horse and started back down the trail without another word. Jed watched until the rider was gone, swallowed by the trees. That night, the fire burned bright, filling the cabin with the smell of Annie's bread and rabbit stew. The children ate like they hadn't in days, and for once Eli didn't keep glancing toward the door. After supper, Jed sat back in his chair, watching the flames. Sam leaned against his leg, half asleep, the warmth loosening his breathing. "You really mean it?" Sam murmured. "That I'm your son?" Jed rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I mean, you're mine to keep safe. That's what matters." In the years to come, folks in Pine Knot would still talk about Jed Cutter, the quiet mountain man who once bought 3 orphans for $3. Some swore he was a fool, taking in mouths to feed when he barely had enough for himself. Others said there was more to it, that one of those children carried his name for a reason. But Jed didn't bother explaining. The mountains didn't need his stories, and the children already knew the only truth worth telling. They were Cutters now. Every last one dot, and if anyone came to take them, well, there was a reason no man in those parts crossed Jed Cutter twice.